Again, so good to see you. I'll remind you that we're thinking about parenting and starting from the end, and tomorrow the dealing with the littler ones is what's coming. But I want to address at least one more facet of parenting older kids. Preparing them to face the world. And to start into this, I want you to think about the relationship between your children and the world. What is that relationship? On the one hand, the Bible says that your children are not of the world, and that God has chosen them out of the world. That's John 15:19. Your children are not of the world. But on the other hand, the Bible tells you that your children are heirs of the world through faith. Romans 4. So what is a faithful parent's duty in regard to your children in the world? How do you call your children out of the world? I mean, do you call your children out of the world? The answer is yes. Do you send your children into the world? The answer is yes. How do we hold these things together? Do the answers to these questions change as your kids move through various stages of growing up? I think they do. If you have teenagers, I want you to think about this. Within 5 years, your child will reach an age where they're old enough to vote in elections, take up arms and fight in a war, sit on a jury, borrow money from a financial institution, obtain a marriage license on their own, enter into a legally binding contract all on their own. According to the state where I come from, they can give their consent to sexual activity with anybody they want to within 5 years of now. The only thing that qualified my kids to attain this status is the inevitable and irreversible advancement of time. That's the only qualification they have for this. If your child is 10 years old, you are closer in time to the day when they move out than to the day they were born. As Brenda and I look at our own kids today, I can tell you they really are sources of delight. We're so pleased with them. And as our kids have gotten older, I can tell you, Brenda and I sense more and more that gulf between, on the one hand, how great our kids are, and on the other hand, our ability to take any credit for that. They should be messed up. We are becoming more and more pleased with our kids, and yet more and more unsettled about how we parented them, and it's just amazing that they're not messed up. The grace of God is really the key to parenting. Over time, that sense of mystery about parenting has only increased. And the more secure in God's promises and less secure in our own parenting we are. Brenda and I continue to pray daily for our children that God will persevere in them in the faith that He has begun in them. Parenting, of course, is not a matter of inserting tab A into slot B, connecting the dots. It's much more mysterious than that. And so that's why I began with a summary about the relationship between your kids and the world. So this evening now, I want to begin with a summons. I want to summon you as parents to send your kids into the world while calling them out of it. Do both. And I want to examine the practicalities of what this might look like. Give your kids exposure to the world, provide them with experience in the world, but do it so that they are salt and light in the world rather than being salted and darkened by it. So here's a remarkable verse about parenting. I bet you've heard this verse before. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God did not send His Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through Him might be saved. The great parent, the Almighty Father, the one whom you and I worship, didn't just carve out a little niche or alcove for his Son to inhabit. He sent his Son into all habitations everywhere. What kind of parent would do that? And the world that the Father sent his Son into was a perishing world. It was a place fit for condemnation. The world he sent his Son into was not a pretty place. In fact, it was a world filled with pain and death. Notice that the presence of sin and pain and death in the world is a reason for sending the Son. Too many parents today look at sin in the world, they look at the pain, they look at the adversity, the difficulty, and their reaction is to think, not with my kid, you don't. I don't want my kid subjected to that. That's unsafe. Well, the world's not a safe place. Yet the model parent sent his Son into this unsafe place. Now, of course, parents should protect their children, but parents should moderate that protection. You protect your kids only insofar as that protection is consistent with preparing them for a dangerous world. I'll say it again. You protect your kids only insofar as that protection is consistent with preparing them for a world that is dangerous. Again, too many parents pray that their kids will be safe. I pray that my child will be safe. Do you pray that your children will be faithful? And which of those is more important to you? That your kids are safe or that they are faithful? If you truly understand how our Heavenly Father is a pattern for fatherhood, then you should be sending your kids into the world, and your purpose is to transform the world. And of course, your children are members of the body of Christ. Your children, your son, your daughter, are the body of God's Son, the body of that Son whom He sent into the world. Parents, you need to see Jesus in your children. Your children are members of Christ. In your parenting, be imitators of the Heavenly Father who sent Jesus into the world. Send your children to save the world. And I don't mean a precious moments Jesus, the real living Jesus. The Son that this Father sent into the world, how you should send your children into the world. This was a Son who overturns the tables of the money changers. He sent them to feed the 5,000, even though they had meager resources to work with. Send your children to the woman at the well, and send them to tell this woman that the man she's with is not her husband. Send them to that same woman to give her living water. Send your children to weep when they hear the awful news that Lazarus is dead. And send your children to speak words that overcome the sting of death, words that summon forth life. Again, send your children to weep over Jerusalem, and then send them to enter that city and proclaim that its leaders are whitewashed tombs and a brood of vipers. Send your children to lay down their lives for that city, and then pray that the Father would forgive those who killed them. That is how you need to see your relationship between your kids and the world. This means as you send your kids into the world, you must also call them out of the world. In sending them in, they won't be conformed to the world, but that the world would be changed. That's parenting according to John 3:16 and 17. So that's the summons that I'd like to begin with you. And I've got some history notes that I want to offer. And at this point, this is a reading assignment that one of my students has to have read. My student's Mr. Fudge. But this is from Vergerio about, I think, the attribute of fortitude here that he's talking about. He says, he's talking about a contempt for toil. I love that. Listen to this. This man's contempt for toil gives birth to contempt for death as well, and increases his audacity. So intrepidly does he approach every difficulty that one must believe he fears nothing, except perhaps the possibility that he might die an old man. This seems to me an excellent attitude. We should always look to virtue and turn our mind upon famous deeds. We should not care overmuch for life. Goes on. We ought not to fear that we have perchance lived too little, but rather that we have lived too little the life we have lived. I'll say that again. We ought not to fear that which we have perchance lived too little, but rather that we have lived too little the life we have lived. So that's the summons, to train up your kids to be like that. And I want to turn to some of the practicalities about what this looks like and about the dangers of the world, about worlds that are filled with Taylor Swifts and Travis Kelce's. And I'll organize my practical points under two basic headings, and they're this: to give your kids a healthy exposure to the world and then provide them with experience in it. Give them an exposure and to provide them with experience. And it's a certain kind of exposure, a healthy exposure. And so turn with me, if you will, to Proverbs chapter 7. We were in Proverbs 6 earlier, now Proverbs 7. And I'm going to pick up at verse 7, Proverbs 7:7. And as we look here, pay attention not only to what is taught in this passage, but how it is taught. Fascinating passage on parenting here, Proverbs 7:7. My son, keep my words and treasure my commands within you. Keep my commands and live, and my law as the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers, write them on a tablet of your heart. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call understanding your nearest kin, that they may keep you from the immoral woman, from the seductress who flatters with her words. Notice that this passage is launching into a story about two women. One of them is in verse 4. In verse 4, wisdom is a woman. And set over against wisdom is the other woman in verse 5, the immoral woman. All right, let's look at the first woman. Pardon me. We have in verse 7 the father's words. Keep my words, says the father to his son. And then keep my commands and live. Proverbs 7. I'm sorry, this is in verse 1. Verse 1. In verse 2, keep my commands and live. The father's law is the apple of the son's eye. His words are bound to the son's fingers. The father's commands are the tablet on the son's heart. The father's words are the son's sister. The father's words are wisdom, the faithful woman. But verse 5 identifies another woman, the immoral woman, the seductress who flatters with her words. And if her words flatter, there's something attractive about her words, especially to young men. This flattering woman offers perverse counsel. She's another counselor who has words that are available to the son. Two counselors are available to the son here. The father's words and the seductress's words. Two women are beckoning him. Proverbs 7 here it presents an illustration of effective parenting. What is Lady Wisdom? She's the voice of a parent. She's a father's wise counsel to his son. You see the father's leadership, his advice, his counsel, the father's fathering steers the child from the seductress. Parenting is God's appointed means of protecting your kids from the world. Dad, sit up and take notice. It is your wisdom that should present itself to your son as an attractive woman. And your wisdom must be more attractive than the flattery of a seductress. Now the chapter goes on in some detail with the wise words of a father. Proverbs 7 is a model of good parenting. Look further at the interaction between father and son, picking up at verse 6. I'm sorry, I'd begun at verse 1 through 6 here. Now at verse 6. At the window of my house I looked through my lattice and saw among the simple I perceived among the youth a young man devoid of understanding, passing along the street near her corner. He took the path to her house. In the twilight, in the evening, in the black and dark of night, and there a woman met him with the attire of a harlot and a crafty heart. She was loud and rebellious. Her feet would not stay at home. At times she was outside, at times in the open square, lurking at every corner. She caught him and kissed him. With an impudent face, she said to him, I have peace offerings with me. Today I have paid my vows. She's a church girl. So I came out to meet you diligently to seek your face. And I have found you. I have spread my bed with tapestry-colored coverings of Egyptian linen. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love until morning. Let us delight ourselves with love. For my husband is not home. He has gone on a long journey. He has taken a bag of money with him and will come home on the appointed day with her enticing speech. With her enticing speech, she caused him to yield. With her flattering lips, she seduced him. Immediately, he went after her as an ox goes to the slaughter or as a fool to the correction of the stocks, till an arrow struck his liver as a bird hastens to the snare. He did not know it would cost his life. Now, therefore, listen to me, my children. Pay attention to the words of my mouth. Do not let your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths, for she has cast down many wounded, and all who were slain by her were strong men. Her house is the way to hell, descending to the chambers of death. Some points to notice here. First, notice that the Son is not being sheltered from the world. The Father's not clapping his hand over his Son's eyes, saying, Son, don't look, don't see this. He's calling his Son over the window, saying, hey, Son, take a look at this. Telling his Son to look straight out into the world. And notice that the world that the Son's being exposed to is not an edited version. It's the real world as the world actually presents itself. It's not PG rating. It's not a sanitized version. It's not a pre-digested version of the world by the parent in order to make it more palatable to the child. And notice that the Son is not being exposed to the world, and this is very important. He's not being exposed to the world all by himself. The Father is there with him. Here's what the Father, in exposing his Son to the world, is not doing this. He's not saying, okay, Son, go and study the seductress on your own. Go into the world, and if you encounter a seductress, I hope that goes well. The Son's exposure to the world is part of an ongoing conference between Father and Son. The Son is not flying solo in this interaction. So notice then, as you think about the world and its flatteries, its seductions, its seductive corruptions, the Son is not facing them alone, but the Son is facing them with Dad. I had a friend of mine. I thought this was a great moment in parenting. He talks about his son. When his son was coming of age, there was a friend group was going out to a movie, and the movie was, well, it had some improprieties in it and so what my friend did is he said, he said this, I don't think you should go with your friends. You want to go to the movie, son? Yeah, he wanted to go to the movie. How about this? You and I, that same night, you're not going to go with your friends, you're going to go with me. Taking care to drive to the next town so that they wouldn't be seen with the friend group that was going there. And so then there was a scene that you might expect that presented itself on the screen, and my friend was, so what would you do if you were watching this scene right now with Sally sitting by you? What would you do if you were watching this scene right now and the son just squirmed? It was a great moment of parenting, I think. And that's kind of a modern day picture, I think, of what Solomon's doing in Proverbs chapter 7. And I want to talk about then sending your kids into the world, and we need to talk a little bit about the world and some practicalities for this. But that's the paradigm. The paradigm passage, I think, is Proverbs chapter 7. And because I am who I am, history guy, I've got some slides up here that I want to talk you through and to think about popular culture here. So, and I'm going to do this from a historical perspective, the goal being to give you some categories as you think through and then have conversations with your kid. What I can't do, and you know that I can't do this, I can't talk you through the next thing that's going to present itself to you as a parent. I don't know what it is. You don't know what it is. Okay? Which is why I'm going to go back to history, and sometimes the retrospect and hindsight can give us some cleaner categories to bring to bear on whatever new and latest thing is going to come up. I'm just a horrible source for the new and latest thing. I'm not going to give you the new and latest thing, but I think that the past can sometimes help us with the new and latest thing. So here we are. I'm going to talk about consumerism, mass market, and then consumerism meeting the mass market. And we're going to go back in time here to help you think about and maybe have some talking points to move through with your kids. So starting with consumerism, I want us to go back 150 or so years, to the late 19th century, when we confront the manufacturer. This will be the manufacturer maybe in 1900 who was in a very different place than somebody 100 years prior in 1800, okay, where we have a craft culture. If a cobbler back in 1800, the time of Thomas Jefferson, was making shoes, how would he decide what sizes to make and how many of what sizes to make back then? Like size 7.5. Should I make size 7.5? If so, how many? How would he decide? Some of you probably know. How would he decide? How would you decide? If you were, imagine if you will, you're making shoes and it's 1800. So how do you decide what size to make? What color to make? What's that? The customer. So you have an interaction with the customer? Yeah. It's going to be made to order, right? He's going to make shoes the same way that a chef in a nice restaurant decides how much of one thing to make. The order comes in and then you make it and you fill the order. And so everything he makes, he has a customer already in view, a particular individual customer in view, just like how conventional restaurants still work today. Made to order. But the whole process of manufacturing, it takes advantage of economies of scale. You learned all this in school, and you repeat processes and you repeat stages of the process, so you wind up with a warehouse of shoes. But this creates a problem. Okay, this is a problem what the old manufacturers had to deal with, is I've made stuff, but I don't have the customers. I've made stuff, but I don't have the customers. I have a warehouse full of shoes. Okay? And so that's my problem. I make stuff that hasn't sold yet. Okay? This is a modern phenomenon. And so the solution is to convince people that they need what I've made. Advertising, right? Now, on the other side of it, the worker also has a problem. Imagine the craftsman who goes into his shop with a bunch of materials, and then 6 months later, out comes a car with a functioning internal combustion engine. I would be impressed with that guy. There are some people like that. I know a guy like that, and I'm not that guy. That's really impressive craftsmanship, to take the raw materials and then out comes a car. Okay. Now, let's go back to that guy making shoes. His pride of place in the community, his dignity before the community is going to be attested by the quality of his shoes. Look, she's wearing the shoes that I made. He's wearing the shoes that I made. That's my craftsmanship. Think about the carpenter. The table in that house, at that dining room, that's the table I made. And I made a table over there, and I made the bookcases over there. And that makes you stand up straight in the community and walk tall down the street. But if you are a worker, think about the worker on the Ford assembly line versus the guy who built the car in the shop. He puts the left rear quarter panel onto the chassis. Chassis moves on, and then he puts another left rear quarter panel onto the chassis. Then he puts another left rear quarter panel onto the chassis. That's what the worker does. Okay. What's the worker's effort? How does that relate to the finished product? Can he say, I made that? No, he's become alienated from the product. The product. The stuff that I make no longer displays my talent. So here we have a worker. One guy is taking leather and he's cutting up a bunch of leather, and he gets good at leather cutting. And then these guys take cut leather and they start sewing it. And they sew it. I'll make one stitch and I'll move it down the line. The next guy will sew it. And this guy is going to blow it up and make basketballs. This is in the Spalding assembly line around the turn of the 20th century. Okay. But if there's somebody bouncing a basketball, do you say, look at my craftsmanship, if you're one of these guys? No. Now, so the problem that the worker has, the stuff that I make doesn't display my talent, my value to the community, because I just exert effort. But what if I'm working in a factory? What do I have to show for my effort? You know what I have to show for it. What do I come away with? Why do I stay in the factory? Yeah, I get a paycheck. And so the productivity that I have and the value of my productivity is registered in a paycheck that I turn around and purchase something with. Buying. In the pre-industrial age, my value in the community was reckoned by the quality of my craftsmanship. You can see my benefit to the community in the craftsmanship that exists and is evident in the community. But now, in a post-industrial age, or in industrial age, the value of my productivity is reckoned by what I can convert my labor to, a paycheck, and it registers in buying. This is what consumer culture is. When your identity, your value is transferred not from the dignity of the object made, but in the accumulation of stuff that you can buy and its quality. Okay. That is consumer culture. And of course, that advertising that meets the manufacturer's need also meets the worker's need. I am looking for stuff to put my paycheck to that is going to give me value, and so advertising needs to send a certain message to draw that worker. Okay, so this is how it works. So here we have, this is really great to look at older ads. Meet the girl men want to kiss. Smoothly alluring lips, soft as velvet, with a provocative glow of color like the heart of a rose. No wonder men are fascinated. And so you mass produce a bunch of lipstick, and now you got to cast about for customers. Well, you need to tell them a story. It's going to, and you customers who have wage earner, here's how you can translate your labor into something that makes you valuable. All right, that's the text there. How about this one? Why should you smoke Old Gold cigarettes? What does this have to do with cigarettes? Yeah, you'll be like that, right? All right. All advertising basically follows this pattern. You've got you, here is you, and then there's a vision of the good life. How do you get to the good life? You know how you get to the good life. How do you get to the good life? Yeah, there you go. The product. The product. All right. And so here we go. I love this. Halitosis makes you unpopular. This is Listerine here, just to blow up and see. Well, first of all, look, appreciate the image. So which there's three individuals here, two women and a man. Which one are you supposed to relate to? Yeah, and it's the cautionary tale relationship, right? This is not a happy story. Halitosis makes you unpopular. Unpopular. It's inexcusable, can be instantly remedied. No matter how charming you may be, how fond of your friends are, you cannot expect them to put up with halitosis, which means unpleasant breath forever. They may be nice to you, but it's an effort. Now, the ad agency, the Listerine was developed in the 19-teens, and they applied it as a balm for all kinds of, it was an ointment, you rub it on your skin, and they realized that it takes care of bad breath, and they thought, how do we pitch this? And so they invented the term halitosis to make it sound medical sounding. Halitosis is a product of an advertising boardroom, not any medical reflection, but it's this condition now. All right. Don't fool yourself that you have never had halitosis, as do so many self-assured people who constantly offend this way. You have it. All right. But let's come back here. All right. So what's the good life? Do you see a narrative of the good life here? And you see a narrative of the bad life. There's the bad life to be avoided, the good life to be cultivated. You don't want to be lonely. You want to be a girl who gets danced with, don't you? That's the good life. That's the good life. Is that the good life? Have you ever seen anyone in a hurry while drinking Corona? It's the only line in the ad. Have you ever seen anyone in a hurry while drinking Corona? That's the fine life, baby. I love this series of Corona ads featuring Snoop Dogg because it actually says the good life. Like, it's the good life. And so it's really easy. It's low-hanging fruit. Is that the good life? The good life is absence of hustle. The good life is absence of industry. Is that the good life? Again, a great series of ads here. I can't say it like Snoop Dogg. Everyone's so busy keeping up. Forget about the Joneses. We all on our telephones is with the text and the tweets and the beats. What he says, she says, can't even follow the thread. Down in the hole we all go. Me, I like keeping up too with my Corona and my attitude. That's the fine life, baby. All of the text threads and busyness, Now, here's my encouragement to you. With advertising, think about Solomon, Proverbs chapter 7. Do you say, hey, let's watch some of this together. Let's get on the web, kids. Remember what the good parent did. it gave them exposure, but then, advertisements are great. And the key question is always, okay, what's the vision for the good life? What's the vision for the good life? It's usually the kind of subtle thing, and yet it's the most necessary thing in almost every ad. What's the vision for the good life? Buy your Corona, drink Corona, and then like Snoop Dogg, you'll be on the, and then ask them the good life. And what is the good life? Teach your kids to read the world. Teach your kids to read the world and to see what the world is up to expose its seductions for what it is. Again, Proverbs chapter 7, the seductress. Look at that seductress. Pay attention. Where does that go? Can you imagine, son, how about a lifestyle would you like to live like this 24/7? Is this the way it is? Going on vacation is a nice thing. Going to the beach is a nice thing. But, anyway. Teach your kids to read the narrative. Talk with them about these things. Listen to music with them. If they like music, then listen to music with them. Talk about it. Why do you like that? What's intriguing about that? In Proverbs chapter 7, there were some intriguing things about that. That seductress, she paid her vows. Excuse me. And with flattering words, she seduced him. Talk to your kids about these things. Make this sort of routine. You can't get away from this stuff. Brenda and I were driving here, so many billboards. You have no shortage of exposure. All right. So that's what consumerism is, and just some encouragement to you in ways of thinking about conversations that are worth having with your kids, and hopefully that little simple review of what consumer culture is and where it comes from is a good way of thinking about it. Consumer culture really is a culture where people's value and identity is reckoned and determined by what they purchase. That's what consumer culture is. It differentiates a consumer culture from other forms of culture. And it arises in modernity in a unique way. Well, these messages rely on some technological developments too. So we go back to the 1800s. American progress. Of course, we have the sunrise on the right side, and of course it's odd that this reads right to left rather than left to right, but the reason why it does, of course, is expansion is westward. Definitely, you're all in California here, you can appreciate that. Expansion's always westward, and you've got the city over on the right, which is bright and shining, and civilization, of course, the Native Americans are always receding into the dark on the lower left, and you see the miners with their pickaxes and the farmers up there with his stagecoach, the guys hunting buffalo up above them, and to the right you've got the railroad coming, and what does she have in her hand? She's got a book and a telegraph wire. Transportation and communication. That's American progress. Transportation and communication. Advertising becomes really interesting here. Before we got wireless, you can appreciate pre-wireless versus wireless here when you see what telegraph wires used to look like. But the telegraph was pretty amazing. It allowed communication to travel for the first time in human history. Finally, for it to go faster than either a horse could run or for wind could push a sail. Okay, George Washington got messages the same speed as Julius Caesar got messages, as fast as a horse could run or as fast as wind could push a sail, until we developed the telegraph. The telegraph was pretty amazing. We can also move people and things and goods. 1850, here we are. This is railroads. 1870 up above. Oh, finally, we've got it out to California, and by 1890, Los Angeles is in the picture, so now you can see where when you come onto the grid here, even up in Idaho, we're on the grid by 1890. So we've got communication transportation networks. And these communication and transportation networks facilitate some interesting developments, which is the ability for the first time to have people in New York and Los Angeles reading the same material, and they can read the same material at pretty close to almost the same time through telegraph wires and then newspaper articles. It's amazing that people so distant from each other can kind of read the same thing and experience the same thing. Magazine publishers can ship their magazines across the way. Now, these numbers here signify something that was really interesting that developed with magazines and also newspapers, printed material in the 19th century. It used to be with the old newspapers, the newspapermen would make their money by selling newspapers. So the readers were their customers. And so they would sell newspapers. But then an interesting thing happened in the 1890s. We had two rival newspapermen, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, who went toe-to-toe trying to get more customers in New York for their New York newspapers. And so Hearst and Pulitzer went at it, and they both discovered about the same time a shift in their economic model. They realized that the more people who read their newspapers, the more valuable their advertising space was on their newspapers. So, for example, if I put an ad, and that ad goes in a magazine that circulates to 100 people, and then the same ad that goes into a magazine that circulates to 100,000 people, which would I rather put my ad in? And now Hearst and Pulitzer, and then others were soon to follow, realized that they would make more money from advertisers rather than from subscribers and paper buyers. And so what happened to the price of the paper? The more I sell, the more money I make. So the price goes down and down and down till the papers went down to 1 cent. And magazines went from subscriptions from $1 down to 15 cents to get 12 issues of a magazine, because you could sell more that way. And the price went down and down and down, so you could print more and more, get them before more eyes. And through this technology and business modeling, we wind up with tons of printed material in just the span of 2 generations. Circulation, this is just magazines. Newspapers were even more. This creates an environment where a bunch of people are reading and seeing the same thing. The vision for the good life is being circulated to a lot more people and penetrating the ranks of society much more deeply than it had ever before, and reaches across space. So let's talk about consumerism then meeting the mass market. Let's take one of these magazines, the Ladies' Home Journal. Ladies' Home Journal in 1897 publishes a series of the American woman. This is the ideal American woman. Ladies' Home Journal, one of the most highly respected magazines. If you were a proper woman, you had this on your nightstand or on your coffee table. Ladies' Home Journal. And here we have the woman in religion. We have 4 generations represented, a multi-generational vision here. We've got the mom, there's grandma, great-grandma, and the daughter kind of growing into this. Another in the same series, the woman in the home. She's cultivating herself. She's in mixed company. There's what the men and women are doing. This is feminine propriety here in the Ladies' Home Journal. But something happened really fascinating is one of the great illustrators of the day, a guy named Charles Dana Gibson, got famous for his illustrations. And he was so famous, he made the cover of Ladies' Home Journal in 1903. Mr. Gibson's American Girl. Charles Dana Gibson got famous for these drawings of a particular vision of femininity. Some of you, if you're a fan of Anne of Green Gables, might remember seeing there's a scene where Anne is primping to go somewhere and her friend Diana said, "Anne, you look just like a Gibson girl." Now you see what the Gibson girl is. The Gibson girl, a certain notion of femininity. Charles Dana Gibson became a celebrity as an illustrator. Does a Gibson girl really exist? No, she's the product of Charles Dana Gibson's pen. And so everyone wants to put their hair like this. These Gibson girls, a certain ideal type here. And the Gibson girl is often portrayed in relationship to other things. Like, do you want to be the lady on the right, the stuffy guy on the left? You know, you can't have the Gibson girl. She just rises above it. You got two women, the angry men. Anyway, you see the Gibson girl. Do you see what these Gibson girls are poking at with their magnifying glass and prodding? It's a guy. Now, this is great stuff. This created a sensation, but I want to show you what happened out here in Los Angeles then. So the Los Angeles Herald in 1905 puts this question out there: has Los Angeles a Gibson girl? Or is there a Gibson girl in Los Angeles? Now, I want you to realize what happened. The fact that this question is being asked is fascinating. Charles Dana Gibson never came out to California. But they're asking, do the girls that we interact with here in California measure up to the Gibson girl? What we're starting to see here is young men and young women changing how they conceive of feminine beauty and attractiveness. A generation earlier, so let's talk about shallow guys. You have shallow guys through all generations, right? And they might have worldly attachments to girls and visions for girls. Or they can be dignified, they can be shallow, but how are guys going to develop their notion of what a pretty girl is? It's by the guys gathering, talking about the girls in their experience, in their lived experience in their town. Now what we have is a community drawing their notions of what makes a pretty girl from a completely different source. And it's nationalized and it penetrates the ranks of society. Rather than face-to-face human interactions drawing your sense of value, whether it's petty or dignified, a lot of this is petty, I'll grant you, but I want you to see that the motor is mediated now and presented like this. That's where the notion is coming from. Has Los Angeles a Gibson girl? How bizarre is that question? Okay. Well, you know what this leads us, the American Girl face. So this leads to where we were, in the 1990s, where we have images then that are put forward as that, and people in their experience assess themselves based on whether or not they align with or depart from a constructed image, a curated image that's in the media, that's been happening now for over 100 years. Okay. And it continues into the 1990s. I would encourage you to talk to your kids about this. And sometimes just talking about the mechanisms and the strangeness of it hopefully should be striking to them. Like, how did that work? Why are we even asking this question? How did that happen? And have these conversations with your kids. So as you expose your kids to the world, again, be the parent in Proverbs 7 and ask questions when you're watching the game on TV and Snoop Dogg's there on the Corona ad, saying, that's an interesting one. Why did that happen? Where did this advertisement come? Just start asking questions and train your kids to interrogate and identify the vision of the good life, where the vision of the good life comes from, how it aligns with a healthier vision for the good life. There's not a lot here. It's kind of shallow. It's more than kind of shallow. But we oftentimes don't train up our kids to just interrogate it. Just interrogate it. And parents should begin interrogating that with them. Now, and we know how this happens also with people. Cities, again, to be lonely in a crowd was a new phenomenon born of the modern world when you have concentrated populations and a weird experience that people have that they didn't have in pre-industrial times, which is you would go down a street and you would experience people you never saw before, and then the next day you'd go down the same street and again you'd experience people you never saw before. And then the day after that you'd go down the street and experience people you'd never seen before. In a big bustling city, as you drive by the cars on the streets today, it's kind of like that, where it's a familiar street and yet you're in a crowd that's undifferentiated. It's a mass of people. Okay. It used to be that you would see somebody, and maybe if it's the first time, that's a stranger. And if they're not a stranger, it's someone you know. And the strangers, like the very notion of stranger is kind of interesting. It takes a norm of people you're acquainted with, and the stranger sticks out. What about when the strangers are normal? It's a weird phenomenon that develops, and it creates a condition of loneliness in a crowd. Loneliness in a crowd, where you can be in the midst of people and yet alone, right? It's a distinctively modern phenomenon. And we've developed ways of coping with this, where we start vicariously participating in individuals so that I will start to see myself and my experience through a mediated image. And so the more I am like this image, then his experiences can be my experiences. It creates a thirst for vicarious participation. This is Douglas Fairbanks and Clara Bow, two very famous people, and we wind up with people asking, do they have it? Whatever it is that sort of compels that vicarious participation that solves people's anxieties about being lonely in a crowd. Oh, if I am like this person, or perhaps my basis for interacting with you can be a conversation about what we read together in the media. Okay. So it solves that loneliness in a crowd. We wind up with these funny things that develop in the 1920s. Here's Charles Lindbergh. Let's see. He has a baby. He's the guy who crossed the Atlantic Ocean in a plane, and everyone was fascinated by Charles Lindbergh. And so when he has a baby, people send him congratulation cards, thousands of them, because at this time we're just trying to navigate that strange relationship. Is it personal or is it impersonal? Is it personal or is it impersonal? And that distinction gets collapsed with these people. And so what would possess people to write a note of congratulations to Charles Lindbergh when he has a baby? Okay. And then when Rudolph Valentino dies, I want you to notice that this is a Seattle paper. way across the country from where Valentino was, the Sheik, he's famous for a role, the Sheik, nearly 100 heard is 50,000, mostly girls, fight to view him when he was lying in state because they had a relationship with Rudolph Valentino. Okay. Loneliness in a crowd creates an environment where a celebrity starts to make sense. It's a distinctly modern phenomenon, a post-industrial phenomenon, a product of the cities, very different than a well-known person that we've had throughout all the ages. It's a mediated and curated vision of somebody that you're exposed to through a mediated experience. And it creates some really interesting and peculiar behaviors. All right. One girl wanted to make sure that she was displaying the appropriate response, and so she brought onions with her to Valentino's memorial so that she would be seen tearing up. Because that's the right socially acceptable response to Valentino, because you care. Now, this is a weird behavior, isn't it? And yet, here we are. Here we are. Again, I would encourage you to talk to your kids about this. How did that happen? Why does that happen? Why do you care? How did you come to care? Do your friends care? Are you talking to your friends about this? And what's the vision for the good life that is projected here? I go into the history of it partly because that's who I am, but also partly because I'm trying to suggest some categories and some approaches. Not that you need to bring up Lindbergh and Valentino, but it's my way of trying to communicate this with an X-ray that kind of analyzes this, that I think you need to train your kids to do and to think about. It's part of taming the seduction of that seductress, and it's important for your kids. And then it gets really interesting as we move more recent, back when I was growing up, this is not recent at all, where music used to be something that if you were listening to music, it was inherently a community activity. But then we can make our music portable with headphones. And so it becomes possible for each of us in this room to be listening to different music. That was a really interesting development that arose in the late 70s and early 80s. And then when we all get personal computers and we can print stuff, we can start desktop publishing in the 90s. Really interesting thing develops where we can not only consume things individually, but we can produce things individually. And then layered on top of that is the iPhone. The iPhone, which, and through social media, people can become their own curators of their own image and their own consumers and curate the content that they themselves consume. And so you can build up your own vision of the good life. Now you're in the role of what Listerine was doing, but you're your own Listerine. You can call if you're a male, you can call yourself a female. You can, just like if the Listerine people can do it, I can do it too, about myself. And that's the vision of the good life. That's a historical reflection that brings us to some of the issues that your kids confront. The takeaway here is, I hope that you will just develop a habit and a practice of raising questions around them, with them. Isn't that interesting? Watch what they watch, see what they see, experience what they experience along with them, rather than having them fly solo. Again, what did the father in Proverbs chapter 7 doesn't say, there's some interesting things out there in the world. Hope it works out well for you, son. No, he says, let's come over to the window together and let's talk about this. That's what's happening in Proverbs chapter 7. This should become a habit and a routine in your homes, especially with your older kids. So, again, as I walk through some of these, again, advertising music, the whole panoply. And I would really encourage you to keep them away from the cell phones as long as you can. We can talk more about that if you like. But with that, I think we'll call our time up here. Expose your kids to the world in order to send them into the world to change the world. Thanks.